Super Mario Sunshine, the underrated game of the Mario franchise for the GameCube, isn't it? And to think that it was one of the pillars that helped the Nintendo GameCube stay on the radar, because otherwise, I think a lot of people would have forgotten this console even existed. Of course, I'm not being serious. After all, the GameCube was pretty successful despite the fact that it had to compete against the PS2 and the original Xbox. It also had a huge variety in its roster of games. But that begs the question, even though the Nintendo GameCube was able to sustain itself and stay relevant in that market, what about the consoles that you actually never heard of? Stay with me, we're gonna talk about them. Roll the intro! Remember that if you like the video, leave a like, a comment and subscribe to my channel because it would help me a lot. Having said that, let's get back to the video. Hello everyone, Juanu here. So yeah, consoles. The best entertainment system for anyone to have unless you're a PC gamer. Ever since the first video game consoles started to appear, it was no surprise that suddenly every single company wanted a piece of that cake. I mean, it even got Microsoft into the ring and dominated the market for a while. However, there are cases of consoles that you may not have heard about because 1. You're too young and I'm an old hag at this point, 2. Because they were so poorly developed or publicized that they ended up in oblivion, or 3. They were just not relevant enough. Well, I'm going to tell you about the weirdest and most obscure consoles you've never heard of. Spoiler alert, I will not include any special edition of any well-known console or region-exclusive add-ons, since these do not make the console itself. Having said that, let's start with the list.
Gamecom active.
Alright, we're starting with a console whose name sounds more like a webpage for flash games for little kids in the 90s who were allowed to use the living room PC. After the massive success of Nintendo's Game Boy, the market seemed ready for the idea of handheld devices. I mean, a console you can carry anywhere? Count me in. Nokia released the N-Gage, Sony the PSP, even Sega tried to compete with the Game Gear. Atari was no stranger to this phenomenon and even decided to launch the Atari Lynx in 1989, the same year the Game Boy was released. Yeesh, tell me about an unbalanced match. Suffice to say that the Lynx was not a success since it sold only 2 million copies in the span of 7 years. To put it into perspective, the Game Boy alone sold almost 120 million. You see the difference? Having such a titan in the market, only a few would dare to face the competitive power of Nintendo, and among those few was Tiger Electronics. If you're familiar with this company, you would know about them for the crappy disposable games they sold. But they tried to go a step further. Released in 1997 with a retail price of $69.95, it had features that were quite advanced for its time, like a touchscreen and internet connectivity. In 1997, why did it fail? Well, for being a video game console, it did not seem to be sold as a video game console in the first place, but rather a gimmicky and complicated working tool, like a beeper. It came with a calculator, a calendar, a phone book, and solitaire. Also, the connectivity thing was more a marketing thing than anything else because it did not work properly. Also, it did not help the fact that it had a very small roster of games. It only had a limited scale of grace, a very small screen, and it was competing against the superior Game Boy Color. How many games did the Game.com have? 20. Yes, for a console publicized for gamers, it only had 20 games. 21 if you count solitaire. And even if you can conform with the quality over quantity, well, you're not getting either. Games looked horrible, played awful, and it required 4 batteries to stay on compared to its competition that only required 2. We can still criticize this bad boy, but there isn't much good to say. It only sold over 300,000 units and it was discontinued in the year 2000.
Now and get one of 38 selected games free.
Formerly known as PC Engine GT, globally remembered as Turbo Express, and personally referred as seriously dude, was released in 1990 by NEC Home Electronics, a Japanese technological company more known for selling technological solutions and home electronics such as radios, telephones, and submarine cable system for laying in the Pacific Ocean in 1964. Oh boy, these guys know about technology. Anyway, it was a portable version of another dark console called the TurboGrafx-16 that tried to compete with the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. This console had an interesting features as a backlight, a connection cable to play multiplayer games, and a TV tuner. This one, compared to the Game.com, had a very nice variety of games and it looked phenomenal, for its time at least. It was even called the Rolls-Royce of gaming, and with a good reason. This thing costed $249 in retail. The Game Boy, in comparison, was not really cheap, but $89 against $249. You can see how this was more of a luxury item that only got into the hands of some privileged people. However, it only managed to sell 1.5 million units in its life cycle of 4 years. Great potential, not affordable or interesting enough to survive in this market.
Il tuo nuovo portatile con maxi schermo. Supervision è nei migliori negozi.
Okay, remember when I said at the beginning of the video that I would not include region-exclusive add-ons? Well, I am keeping my word. However, this is not an add-on but a full console, mostly released in Asia and very few places of the globe. The Watada Supervision, or Quickshot Supervision as it was known in the UK, was released by the company Watada in 1992. It tried to compete with the Game Boy while being rather popular in Asia because of its low price of $49.95. Even though it did not have a huge roster of games, it had enough of them to call it respectable. Gotta give it to the underdogs when they deserve it. Despite its monochrome tilted screen, very small size and weird ergonomics, it did do its job, which was playing games, so that's good. However, it had a feature that allowed it to be directly connected to the TV so you could play video games in full color, just like the Super Game Boy did, but without the need of another console or add-on. I mean, this is the core concept of the Switch we have nowadays but done 30 years earlier. So why did it fail then? Easy, the screen sucked so bad that it made the links look good in comparison. Have I mentioned it also competed with the Game Boy? Yeah, you might be a respectable underdog, but if you're still an underdog when you're fighting against the Mike Tyson of handheld consoles, you're still going to lose. It had 11 different variations that try to fix many of its issues and oh dear. How did they even get away with this? Meh, I'm too lazy to investigate. There's not a real number to say how many units it sold, but because of its short lifespan of 2 years, being discontinued in 1994, we can safely say it did not sell well at all, and it did not survive the market. Oh baby! We're on a roll with the handhelds, and this one is a doozy. Gizmondo was a console released in 2005 by Swedish company Tiger Telematics. Nope, not the same company as this one. Two totally different things. And it was originally going to be named the Game Track. You may be thinking that it tried to compete with the Game Boy Advance, but nope, it was trying to compete with Nokia's N-Gage. Oh, for fuck's sake, really? Anyway, Gizmondo was, at a technical level, truly ahead of its time as well. It wasn't just any regular handheld console, it was very similar to what we have nowadays with the Stream Deck and the Anya Neo, meaning that it had an operating system, that being Windows CE, SIM card slot, SMS, JPEG camera, GPS, 128 megabytes of RAM, and Bluetooth, alongside of other boring specifications you as a gamer may not care about. Now, I know what you're thinking, this is nothing special, but let me remind you that this was in 2005. It's been 18 years since then, and this kind of technology was outstanding to those that were not into the tech world. Back then, all of this was a huge upgrade compared to other devices. What about the games? Well, they looked phenomenal. It actually had an amazing performance given the fact that we're talking about a handheld console which was meant to be a formidable opponent to the PSP. But why did it fail? Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to be brief. The company extravagantly spent millions on promotions such as celebrity party at London's Park Lane Hotel and taking part at the 24 Hours of Le Mans despite never making any sort of profit. Its American debut was delayed several times and a widescreen version was announced shortly before its release, resulting in very low sales. With fewer than 25,000 units sold, the Gizmondo was named by GamePro the worst-selling handheld console in history. The Gizmondo was further overshadowed when the Swedish press revealed criminal past of several executives, causing their resignations, including Tiger Telematics CEO Carl Freer. Director of Gizmondo Europe, Stefan Eriksson, was also involved in a Swedish criminal organization called the Uppsala Mafian. By February 2006, the company was forced into bankruptcy after amassing $300 million in debt, and the Gizmondo stopped production. Honestly, a true shame to a very good potential. Released in 1981 by Epoch CO, an electronics and toys company just like Nintendo, was introduced in the Japanese market with great success. No kidding, this is not a bad story, but a rather inspiring one. It costed around 14,800 yen, which compared with, we just take this and then we go into inflation, we compare it with the increase and decrease over years, and the cost change, importation taxes, then we add this and take that. Okay, it was at around $65, let's leave it at that. Don't take my word for it, it was never released in the rest of the world as far as I'm concerned or care about. However, it did dominate the market at a time where video games were not really popular and did what Nintendo did with the NES years later. 8-bit console, easy to plug in, and the games came in cartridges. The console managed to sell over 300,000 units in Japan alone, and there were no competitors until years later when Nintendo and Sega evaporated SCP from the market. That's right, the watch company actually released a console that competed with Nintendo and Sega. This console with a fussy and cute name was released in 1995 and it was supposed to compete with the upcoming Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation. How did it go? Well, take a second to think which one you remember out of these three. Got it? Good, there's your answer. The interesting thing about this one though is that this console is what it was marketed in a very unorthodox manner, where it was mostly directed to female gamers. I wish I was making that up, but I'm serious about this. Why did they think that a console was meant to be just for one half of the market? No bloody idea. But then again, it did not sell well. Just like the Watada Supervision, there's no exact data on how many units were sold, but it's certain that it did not sell well as it only lasted 3 years in its production and thus fell to obscurity. So much so that there's little to no information regarding these console specifics.
Get a channel F video system. Believe me, you'll have a a ball.
Available at Dart Drug.
And to finish today's list, we've got a console that is as old as it sounds. Released in 1976, the Fairchild Channel F was one of the first video game consoles ever made, being the only one to be a true successor to the Odyssey and only competitor with the Atari 2600. Well, until others arrived and catastrophe plagued the market. Developed by Fairchild Camera and Instrument, was sold in a market for a retail price of $169.95. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, if you keep in mind inflation and other factors, that would be a total of over $800 in today's money, which means that today, this piece of junk would be more expensive than a PS5 and an Xbox One X combined at retail price. This one has a very interesting story to be told, but a bit boring to tell in this video since it would need its own separate video. If you want a video regarding this machine, leave the comment to see if you're interested to know more about this. Having said that, the TLDR version of this story is that the games were kinda boring, the price was absurd, and it was overshadowed by the Atari 2600, forcing it to be discontinued in 1983. It sold around 350,000 units compared to the Atari that sold over 30 million units until 2004. That's right, as much as we think that the Atari is a piece of junk nowadays, it's been sold for almost 30 years, and that's saying a lot considering the kind of audience that it was targeted to and the time it was released. So it is a shame to see the Fairchild Camera and Instrument failing with the delivery of the Fairchild Channel F. So there you have it, some of the most obscure consoles ever made. If you liked the video, please click on the like button and leave a comment telling me if you want another video to explore even more weird consoles, or if you want the entire story of the Fairchild Channel F. This is Wano, and thank you for watching. See you next time.
Jeez, my chair is so fucked up!